Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. So, in this recording, we continue our discussion of Nazi anti Semitism. At this point, we're going to talk about the final solution, which is, in short, the Nazi plan and implementation of their ideas about what they wanted to do with the Jewish question. Okay, we already saw that uh, even before the start of the Second World War, Hitler already held views in which the Jews were the ultimate enemy, and that he saw himself and Germany as having the task of eliminating all of the Jews in Europe. Okay, now this is the final solution. The final solution to what was the Jewish problem from the point of view of the Nazis. But this wasn't the only solution. Okay, we already saw in the previous recording that the Nazis first tried excluding and marginalizing the Jews. Okay, stripping them of their jobs, of their positions in government, in schools, in uh, broadcasting. Okay, and then later on, as their efforts intensify, the Nazis would put the Jews into ghettos. Okay, so some people might call that the second solution, transportation. Moving the Jews or people they consider to be Jews into more restricted areas and in effect limiting their freedoms and limiting their movement. Now, at a certain point during the war, the Nazis would come up with what we now call the final solution. This happened in early 1942. Senior members of the hierarchy met at Wannsee in Berlin at this conference. So it was a gathering in order to precisely discuss this question: what do we do about the Jews? Okay, remember that they invaded Poland, and then eventually they decided they launched an attack on Russia. So they had this issue on their hands. What was that? What do you do with the Jews living in those occupied territories? Now, it's worth noting that Hitler was not present at this conference. Okay, we'll come back to that later, why that's important. But the Nazi leadership, they made important decisions as to who was going to be in charge and what was going to be done relative to the Jewish question. So, for instance, Himmler, we've seen him before, the head of the SS and the secret police, the Gestapo, took charge of the elimination of the Jews in Germany and in all occupied territories. So remember that the Nazis already set up concentration camps in Germany, and then they already had some labor camps in different places, and these labor camps, eventually they would be transformed into, well, more intensive slave camps, and then slave labor camps, and then eventually into death camps, into places where people were worked to death, to utter exhaustion and death, and then many of them eventually were sent to the gas chambers. Okay, so we're talking about infamous places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Chelmo. We're talking about a good number of camps. And as you can see here, a rather very cynical, um, very cynical way of greeting all the prisoners who came into Auschwitz, like saying that work makes you free. Can you imagine that? Imagine seeing that if you were one of those prisoners. So now, just to give you some detail, most Eastern European Jews, they were taken to different places in Eastern Poland, But we're talking about this because I want you to have a clear idea of the scale of these operations, of these things that happened. Okay, by 1942, the Polish Jews who were put into ghettos, into a ghetto in Warsaw, they were moved to Treblinka, and we're talking about 300,000 people. Most Western European Jews, they were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in the south western part of Poland, and just in a matter of months, in a matter of barely a year, the Nazis were able to kill 4 million Jews. Okay, and even after decisive defeats in 1942, 1943, the the Germans, they kept on going. They stuck to the plan. They kept on this effort to eliminate the Jews in Europe. So, for instance, in 1944, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were brought to Auschwitz. And then, even in the face of the Russian advance, remember, the Germans were defeated in Stalingrad, and then the Red Army, you know, started to rush towards Berlin, driving the Germans out of Russia. Even in the face of this, when the Russians were coming, coming into German occupied territories, the Germans, what they did was to empty their camps and force their prisoners to take these marches, which were, you know, for all intents and purposes, death marches, where people were, had to march to the point of total exhaustion and death. And many of them were even just exterminated on the spot. Now, I know you're already familiar with this, but just in case some of you don't know how it happened, so how did the final solution work? How was it implemented? So you have in the earlier days the Jews being stripped of their citizenship, forced to migrate or forced to change jobs or to sell their businesses, and so they were just embarrassed, humiliated, and then eventually they were put into ghettos, um, you know, and that meant that these ghettos were guarded. You couldn't just, if you were considered to be Jewish, you couldn't just leave without permission, you know, without making your intentions clear, telling the Nazi guard where you were going, etc. And you can imagine that there were limited food supplies as well. And then eventually, these people in the ghettos, they were told that they had to be moved. They were going to another place. So they were put into wagons. Most of these wagons were used for transporting animals, so train wagons, and then they were stuffed into these very small spaces where there was barely any air. Of course, while they were being transported, there was no food, there was no way to go to the restroom, barely any water. So people, suffered, and some even died, on the way to the camp. Of course, the Jews did not know that they were going to be brought to a death camp or to a slave labor camp. A lot of them still hoping that it wouldn't be so bad. And when they get to the camp, what happens? They're told to let go of their belongings, for instance, and then to go into a line. Doctors would examine them, so they had to line up. Doctors would examine them, and if a doctor thought that this particular person is too weak, the doctor would say, "Can you please step out and then join this other line?" And everyone who's deemed to be too weak to work by these doctors, they were either shot right away or gassed right away. So basically, they were just exterminated. And everyone else who survived at least this kind of screening, they would be worked to death, put in barracks, in beds. We're talking about 7 to 8 people to a bed. They were very poorly fed. They had to work long hours, day in and day out. They didn't have the right clothes. The clothes didn't fit. The boots didn't fit. They had only soup and a little piece of bread to eat every day. So horrific conditions, and a lot of these people died in the gas chambers. If you were considered to be too weak to work, you were sent to the gas chambers. These gas chambers were packed with people, and then gas was released. They were poisoned standing up, and these gas chambers were so full. So even after these poor people died, the corpses were still standing, and then the corpses were brought to the crematorium, so they were incinerated. And they were put in the ovens. That's how horrific it was. So the consequences of the final solution: plenty of people dead, exterminated, basically executed. They were helpless. Millions upon millions of them shot on the spot or forced to dig, you know, uh, mass graves, and then they were shot. They were worked to death, or they were simply sent to the gas chambers. We're talking about we're talking about 6 million Jews, and then 500,000 European gypsies, and all the other people who were considered to be undesirable by the Nazis. We're talking about political prisoners, um, prisoners of war, POWs, all the other undesirables or asocials, meaning they had some kind of from the point of view of the Nazis, they had some kind of defect. They couldn't contribute to, German society. They were seen to be, you know, uncooperative. If they were communists, if they were intellectuals. They were considered to be an affront, an offense to the Nazi idea of race, of the superior race. So, homosexuals, for instance, people who were seen to be a threat, like Jehovah's Witnesses, all sorts of people sent to their deaths by the Nazis. In 1944, as the Russians were rushing towards Berlin, in Majdanek in Poland, they found unburied corpses, and it was one of the first glimpses, I mean, as a major shock, of the horrors that happened in the camps. Also, let me just point out this website, Faces of Auschwitz. It's a website that displays pictures of the many prisoners that were kept in Auschwitz, and the website even gives some information about these prisoners. Not a lot, but you know, some pieces of information about them survive. I suppose the idea is that, to remind us that many of these prisoners were people, humans with their own life stories, with their loved ones, and for one reason or another, the Nazis sent them to a concentration camp or a labor camp, and eventually they were exterminated. Okay. We'll continue this discussion in the next recording. In the next recording, we're going to deal with some historical questions like, was it always planned, this final solution? Was it planned from the very beginning? Who's responsible for all these atrocities? Okay. So these are some of the questions that we're going to deal with in our next class. I'll see you there.